Well, brethren, last time we began a study, particularly on the life of Solomon. And as we mentioned last time, all learning in life is experiential. But one of the keys in life is that we can skip a lot of pain and a lot of misery in our own lives if we don't have to do all the learning through our own experience. In other words, if we're willing to learn from the experiences of others and put to practice those lessons and not have to go through everything personally ourselves. And in looking at this, we particularly looked at the life of Solomon. Because as we know, Solomon is a man who was blessed with an incredible gift of wisdom. In fact, the Bible tells us specifically he is the wisest man who's ever lived in the history of mankind. But in spite of all this wisdom, there were a number of major mistakes that Solomon made in his life. You might say lessons he had to learn the hard way. And the interesting thing in all of this is in the areas where he really made some of his biggest mistakes, these were not like new ground, you might say. It wasn't like he was faced with new situations that had never been done before and he wasn't sure what to do, so he made mistakes in how he chose to deal with it. To the contrary, the situations where he made some of his biggest mistakes were areas where Moses and Joshua and others before him had specifically recorded God's instructions as to what to do. Solomon just chose out of his own human nature and his own carnality to bypass those instructions and really have to learn some of these lessons the hard way by choosing to do the wrong thing even though he knew better. Because as we saw last time, being king of Israel, he definitely had access to the writings of Moses and Joshua and all those others who had come before him. In fact, being king, it was a requirement that he had to write out his own copy of the law. Now again, I can't say whether he actually followed through on that, but we know that that was available to him and he had been given that instruction. So he certainly had access to know these things, but yet he chose to make some very bad decisions anyway. And as we notice throughout his life, as I mentioned today, we're going to talk about how he made this major transition. But just to recap kind of what we covered last time, this is a man who started off his life, as his reign as king, I should say. And God comes to him kind of in a scene kind of similar to what we oftentimes see in the movies or the cartoons where there's the genie in the bottle, and the genie comes to this individual and says, tell me what your wishes are and I'll grant you your wishes. Well, God does kind of a similar thing with him and comes to Solomon and says, tell me what you'd like and I'll grant your wish for you. Well, Solomon asks for wisdom. And God's very pleased from the fact that he doesn't ask for something just to benefit himself. He could have easily asked for riches or something that would just solely benefit his own life, and he doesn't do that. He asks for something for the overall good of everyone in Israel. And not only that, but the approach he's taking is a very godly one. And what I mean by that is he's asking God, he says, give me a discerning heart that I can know good and evil, so I can distinguish between them. Well, what he's doing is he's asking God to define that for him. In other words, he's not looking into his own human carnal understanding. He's asking God, you show me from your wisdom how you define good, how you define evil, and show me what I should do. Because he said, you've given me this tremendous job to rule over your people. And he's very humble about it. He says, I'm but a little child. I don't know how to go out, how to come in, and I need you to show me. And he's leaning to that understanding. And as I mentioned last time, in the Garden of Eden, there were two trees. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there was the tree of life. And God told Adam and Eve specifically, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because what that symbolized was if they go take that on, is they're taking on for themselves, the right and the responsibility of deciding what is good versus evil through their own carnal understanding, rather than looking to God to define that for them. And see, Solomon gets this very right in the early part of his life. But as we're going to see today, one of the areas where he went so wrong and why his life turned out so differently later is he winds up reversing this decision. He winds up looking to his own understanding, his own experience to define what's right and wrong. And this is where he really goes off path and makes some really, really bad decisions. Because as we saw last time, this is a man who knew had to have at least had access to Moses' writings that specifically said, don't marry wives of other religions. Don't marry women from these other pagan nations because they're going to wind up influencing you. They're going to want to basically try to pull you into their religious worship. Well, he winds up doing it anyway. And Moses had specifically said kings shouldn't have multiple wives. Well, not only does he have multiple wives, he does it exponentially more than everyone else had done. He literally has 1,000 by the time he's done. These are some colossally bad decisions, especially for a man with all this incredible wisdom. And as we saw later last time as well, later in his life, God basically pronounces sentence upon him and says, God's very unhappy with the decisions that he has made. And he says, the punishment that you're going to receive as a result of this is after you die. He says, and I'm just letting you live out your life on the throne fully because of your father David. But after you die, I'm splitting the kingdom up. And the majority of it is going to go away from your line. I'm giving it to Jeroboam. Well, then Solomon makes another very, very bad decision. He hears this and decides, well, you can't replace me with a dead man. So he tries to chase down Jeroboam and kill him. And Jeroboam winds up having to go to Egypt and basically live out the rest of Solomon's reign there, basically to defend his own life. And this is a guy who grew up as a son of King David, who had to have heard the stories of what his father went through. When this very same thing happened to Saul, his father's predecessor, and who's chasing him around, trying to pin him to the wall with a spear, trying to kill him with the same type of logic of God can't replace me with a dead man. So here we have the wisest man who has ever lived in human history, who is given an incredible gift of wisdom by God himself, who not only amazed the people in Israel, who amazed all the leaders of the nations around him, who would come and travel to Israel to be taught by this guy and to be wowed by his tremendous understanding, making colossally bad decisions. Doing things that we can today look at from a common sense standpoint and go, okay, you thought having 1,000 wives was a good idea? You didn't see the train wreck coming here? And we look at this and go, how does this happen? How does a guy start from the place where he was at and wind up making such colossally bad decisions? Well, as I mentioned last time, we're going to answer that question today. Because what we're going to do is look at the book of Ecclesiastes, which really gives us more, you might say, the behind-the-scenes story of what was going on in this man's mind and in his heart that caused this significant transition in his life. So if you'd like a title for this sermon, we're picking up in part 2 in this one. And so the title of this sermon is going to be is Lessons from the Life of Solomon. Actually, Learning the Hard Way, Lessons from the Life of Solomon, part 2. Because when you think about the title, Learning the Hard Way, Lessons from the Life of Solomon, in a lot of ways, this could actually be like a subheading to the title of the book of Ecclesiastes, because that's exactly what the book of Ecclesiastes is about. It's written by Solomon, and it's a story to tell us some major lessons he had to learn the hard way because he insisted on learning it through his own experience rather than simply taking God's word for it. So let's turn over now to the book of Ecclesiastes. And we'll start walking through. We're not going to go through the whole book here, but we're going to go through several chapters and kind of get a feel for this behind-the-scenes story. And as you're turning to the book of Ecclesiastes, I want to just summarize, so I guess kind of set the scene, you might say, for what's happening in this book. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes is very often looked at, by the, I will just say, professing Christian world as a very cynical book. Because if you read a lot of the comments that Solomon makes here, he looks kind of cynical and sarcastic in a lot of the approach that it takes. And it's important to understand kind of what's going on in this book. Because as I mentioned, this is a book written for a man to kind of express, here's a lot of lessons that I really learned the hard way. And what you'll see reading through this book is several things. One, you'll hear him talk about this story as he's telling it kind of after the fact. Because you can very much see from the way the book ends that this is a man looking back at his life after he's kind of learned a lot of these lessons and he's recording the story for us. But as he goes through telling this, there are times in here where he talks about, I said in my heart thus and such. He's kind of telling you, in other words, here's what I was thinking. When I went down this road, this is what the thoughts that were going through my head, and this is the logic I was thinking when I made these decisions. And then he'll kind of tell you how that turned out, and sometimes he'll turn back around and tell you ultimate lessons that he learned from it. And he'll kind of bounce in between these perspectives. And it's kind of important to understand that as you read through this book. Because what we're going to see here, this was a story, you might say a failed experiment in some ways, where a man set out to find what was the best way to have the most fulfilling, enjoyable, pleasurable life possible. But he tries to do that through purely physical means, by satisfying all of his physical desires and physical senses. And it royally backfires on him. So with that in mind, let's start off reading in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, "The words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now we know from this statement, this is obviously Solomon writing this book. It never directly uses him by name here. But who is the king of David who became king in Jerusalem and ruled over Israel? Well, that would be Solomon. So we know for a fact that's who this has to be. Now picking up in verse 2, it says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now personally, I think the meaning of this verse is a little clearer in some other translations. And here's why I say this. If you're like me, when I think of the word vanity, the picture that tends to come to mind is a person standing in front of the mirror thinking, boy, I'm good looking, aren't I? Aren't I just so attractive? Doesn't everybody want to be like me? Because you think that's a person that's going to be vain. And that's not really the idea of what this is saying. I mean, that probably is how we most often use the word vanity in our modern day culture. But the idea of what Solomon's trying to get across here is being empty or meaningless. In fact, to kind of reiterate that understanding, let me read to you Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2 in the NIV translation, because I think it kind of gets this idea across a little clearer. The way the NIV translates verse 2 is meaningless, 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 says the teacher, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. And so that's more the idea of what he's getting across. He's not talking about conceit, he's talking about it being empty and meaningless, without a real purpose. So pick up in verse 3. What profit has a man from all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south, and turns around to the north, and the wind rolls around continually, and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full, to the place from which the rivers come. And there they return again. All things are full of labor, man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Now notice that comment. As I mentioned, and we're going to see this as we go through the next chapter or two, but this is a man who, what this story is about is he set out to find out what was the most enjoyable, fulfilling, pleasurable way to live life. And he tries to do it by just satisfying his physical desires, his physical senses. Well, one of the lessons he learned from this is, physically speaking, our human carnal desires and just satisfying our senses, they're like bottomless pits. In other words, he says the eye is never full of seeing, the ear is never full of hearing. Well, think about that. We may love to listen to beautiful music that we enjoy, but do we ever hear any music that's just so beautiful you think, I'll just never have to listen to any ever again? That was just so satisfying, I'll never need to hear it again. No, that lasts for a little while, and then we want to hear some more, or we want to hear something different. And then the same is true as beautiful scenery. I know with myself, I'm somebody that one of the things I love to do whenever the opportunity is available is I love to travel to beautiful mountainous, picturesque areas and hike around and just enjoy the scenery. But I have to tell you, after I take a trip like that, yeah, it's wonderfully satisfying, but does that fill me up for the rest of my life and think, well, I'll never have to do that again? No, after a little while you're thinking, well, where else can I go next? What haven't I seen? What haven't I done? And we want to do it again. We want to fulfill that some more. If you just think about our normal desires, well, what happens when we buy a nice new brand new car and it's all shiny? Oh, we're thrilled with it. We're all excited about it. What happens after a little while, after a few years though? Well, I might want a little newer one. I might want a little fancier one, or somewhere with some newer bells and whistles on it. Or even with our houses, we can be really happy with a house, and after a while we think, well, maybe I'd like to get a little bigger one, or a little newer one, or do some additions on it, or things, And I'm not saying there's anything inherently bad about that. I'm just saying that's how we are as physical human beings. It's kind of never enough. So when we look at that satisfaction in life, we have to realize if we look at it purely from the means of satisfying our physical senses, our physical desires, we have to inherently realize they're a bottomless pit. And if we're just trying to meet those desires and to fulfill that, it'll never be enough. And we'll always want more. That's the very idea that Solomon was getting at. But because as we're going to see as we read through this story, he tried to take on everything he ever thought was pleasurable, thinking that was going to satisfy him. And he wound up frustrated and unfulfilled and feeling like life is meaningless because he couldn't fill up that bottomless pit is what happened. So let's pick up now in verse 9. It says, that which has been is what will be, and that which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be remembrance of things that are to come, by those who will come after. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek out by wisdom concerning all that was done under heaven this grievous task God has given the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. Now we're starting to get to the point here of what this whole experience was about. He said, he's setting his heart to figure these things out. But let's follow not only what he's trying to figure out, but how he goes about trying to do it. Because that's going to tell us a great deal about how this man made this incredible transition in his life. And picking up in verse 14, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun. Indeed, all is vanity or meaningless and grasping for the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I communed with my heart, saying, in other words, this is the logic of what was going on in my heart and what I was saying to myself when I came to this decision. Look, I have attained greatness and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. Now we're going to come back here in a minute and dissect this sentence because there's a lot that we can glean from what this is about from that very sentence. But just continuing on, I perceived that this was also grasping for the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now notice he said, I set in my heart to know madness and to know folly. What is he really saying here? Well, what exactly is the meaning that he's getting at here? Well, to understand that, let's kind of dissect this from the standpoint of the Hebrew words that were used here to make this English translation, and see what Solomon was really saying by this. Now notice he says, first of all, he set to know madness. What does it mean by madness? Now the Hebrew word here, that's translated as madness in English, and I'll warn you ahead of time here, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciations here, but what's more important here is the meaning of what these words mean. But this word is transliterated into English as hololot, I think is how you say it. It's Holelot. It's Strong's number in 1947. And according to the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the Old Testament by Warren Baker, it's defined as a feminine plural noun referring to madness, delusion. It is found only in the book of Ecclesiastes and means madness, the tendency to try anything to know its outcome. We have a modern day expression, I think, that kind of states the idea of what this is getting at. We refer to throwing caution to the wind. In other words, whatever whim strikes me, I'll just do it and try it, see how it turns out, and just, throw caution aside. Don't look at any warning signs, just do whatever it feels good. That's kind of what he's saying here. The desire to try anything to see how it turns out. I notice he said he wanted to know madness and he wanted to know folly. What does folly mean? What does the Hebrew word here mean? Okay, so the Hebrew word that's translated as folly in English is transliterated into English as siklut. It's S-I-K-L-U-T. Strong's number 5531. And according to the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the Old Testament by Warren Baker, it's defined as a feminine noun meaning folly, foolishness. It is a way of life devoid of wisdom, God, self-understanding, and an understanding of others. Now that's interesting. Notice what he's saying here. I want to understand madness, in other words, essentially just throwing caution to the wind, just impulsively trying anything to see how it turns out. And I also want to understand the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom. Now, how does he want to know them? What does he mean by knowing them? Let's look at that Hebrew word. Now, the Hebrew word used here for know is translated into English as yada. It's Y-A-D-A. It's Strong's number 3045. And again, according to the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the Old Testament by Warren Baker, here's how it's defined. A verb meaning to know, to learn, to perceive, to experience. One of the primary uses means to know relationally and experientially. So understand what he's saying here. He's not saying, I want to know the difference between wisdom and folly and madness from God's perspective. And I'm going to study the writings of Moses and Joshua and all the other people that God has inspired. And I'm going to pray and ask God and watch and observe others. And I'll learn it from this observation. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying, I want to know this relationally and experientially. In other words, I want to learn it from a hands-on experience. And he's saying, I want to learn the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom that way. He's saying, I'm going to go out and play with the fire is what I'm going to do. Because he's not saying, I want to learn this, kind of from observation. No, I want to do it hands-on is what he's saying. So with that in mind, let's continue on here in chapter 2, verse 1. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity, or meaningless. And I said of laughter, it is madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their life. See, here in verse 3, we really get to the core of what this story is about. Because we're going to read later, as we kind of go through this, we're going to jump to the end of the story where he talks about the conclusion of the whole matter. Well, what was the whole matter he was looking at in this book? He was setting out to find out what was the best way for a person to live. What led to the most fulfilling, enjoyable, positive life. Like as he said, all the days that we're here on this earth, what's the best way to live that? That's the question he's asking. But notice what he talked about doing here. I want to lay hold of folly. It's that same idea. I want to firsthand experience this, the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom. But notice what he also says here, because it's really a crazy statement when we think about it. But I'm going to guide myself with godly wisdom while I do it. Now think about that. I'm going to go firsthand experience the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom, but I'll guide myself with wisdom while I do it. Isn't that a duplicitous statement? It is. It's what we today would call living a double life, or having one foot in the world and one foot in the church. Because we think, well, we can kind of play both sides of it and enjoy both worlds and get the benefits of both. And somehow we can play with this fire and not get burned. Because that's what he's telling himself. I can go stick my hand in that fire and I won't get burned. Because see, this is one of the ways that his wisdom bit him. Because this is a man with incredible understanding, but he also had human nature as well. That deceptive side of us that wants to justify things and pull us to sin. Because what do we tend to do as sinful human beings? As I mentioned last time, if you've ever been involved in the sales industry at all or seen any professional sales training, one of the things that they train people in the sales industry to know, and this is just in how to appeal to people to convince them to buy products, is that people have a tendency to make decisions with emotion and then turn around and reverse engineer a logic to back up that decision. Because they train salesmen with this because you want to appeal to a person's emotions. You deserve this product. You really need this product, and kind of get that emotion locked on it, because then they'll reverse engineer a logic to make it make sense in their life to do it. Well, we tend to do the same thing with our own carnal human nature, with our physical carnal desires. Because, if something appeals to our lust or to our greed or our selfishness or whatever, we tend to kind of decide that's what we want to do, but then we have to rationalize it in our mind. And we have to find a way to tell ourselves why it's a good idea and why it makes sense to do that. Well, we'll tend to turn around and kind of reverse engineer that. Well, you can just imagine what Solomon would have thought of. How does a guy justify in his mind, I want to go pursue the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom, but I'll guide myself with wisdom while I do it. In some form or fashion, he decided, I'm the exception. I'll be able to get it. It'll be okay for me to do it because I'm so smart. I'll do it so skillfully. I can stick my hand in that fire and I won't get burned. Isn't that what we all tell ourselves when we compromise with sin? Isn't some version of that what we always convince ourselves? Yeah, I know going down this road is wrong, but I really want to do it anyway. So we then come up with a way to tell ourselves it's okay. And we justify, again, what we oftentimes call today living a double life. We have one foot in the world, one foot in the church, and we convince ourselves that I can do this and it won't turn out disastrously for me. If it didn't work for the wisest man in the history of mankind, why would it make sense it's going to work for us? It won't. It doesn't work for anybody. But just to illustrate this point, let me share with you what I'm going to call a couple of severe examples of this very behavior. As I said, this type of logic here that Solomon is using is something we can all be guilty of in our carnal lives. But let me just show you some of the extremes that this can go to. And then these are both accounts where I'm personally aware of both of these situations. Now this first one, I might have a few of the details wrong with this because it's been probably close to 30 years since I heard this story. But I can assure you I did hear it firsthand from the person involved. But I want to say probably in the early to mid 80s, a headquarters evangelist came out and was visiting the church area that I was attending at the time. And in giving the sermon, he related this story, and again I heard it from him firsthand. And he's telling the story that he was working in his office in Pasadena, and I forget exactly why, but he winds up meeting with a particular gentleman that wanted to talk to him. And in the course of the conversation, he realizes that the person he's talking to is possessed by a demon. Because there's a point in the conversation where he realizes, I'm not really just talking to the physical human being that walked in here. I'm talking to, the demon that has possessed this individual. But instead of making the decision to, throw this guy out of his office, cast out the demon if appropriate or something of that nature, this guy decides that he'd like to learn some things from this. He had a strong interest in history. And what he decided was, hey, I'm now face to face with a being that has lived all throughout human history and has probably been a witness to a lot of things that I'm curious about. So he decides to start interviewing the demon and start trying to glean information about history as a result of that. Because what he is deciding now is I can go toy with the way of life devoid of God and devoid of godly wisdom, but because I'm so spiritually strong, I can handle it. Because literally when he told this story in the sermon, that's how he presented the logic. He basically said, I'm just so spiritually strong I can handle this situation. And even as a teenager, I was a early teenager when I'm hearing this story. And of course my reaction then is not as it would be as an adult today. But even back then as a teenager, I'm listening to this story going, isn't there something terribly wrong with this logic? Isn't this wrong? Because something in the back of my mind said, this just doesn't add up. Well, let me just jump ahead and tell you how the story ended with this gentleman. Move ahead 10 years in history, where the church is, basically being attacked through an apostasy of a lot of, Catholic and Protestant teachings and being led off into heresy. This gentleman totally buys into it, to totally teaches it and supports that whole movement. He wasn't as spiritually strong as he thought he was, because you can't play that game and it not get to you. Let me jump to a more recent story. This has played out in, I guess, the end of this in the last few months. There's an individual that today in Church of God circles has become fairly famous, you might say, for a website that he maintains. He tends to publish a lot of articles on news and prophetic things, and oftentimes maybe church, doctrinal related type of subjects. But he's taken a propensity over the last couple of years, I want to say, at least that I've been aware of really looking into what he himself would even describe as Catholic prophecies. In other words, supposedly prophetic writings that were written by, people associated with the Catholic Church throughout history and such. And now, if you ask this individual, is the Catholic Church the Church of God? Or is that who God is working through? He would readily tell you, no, that's not the case. He would readily tell you that, the Catholic Church has been one of the major forces that has been involved in kind of paganizing what is now referred to as Christianity in our world today. But at the same time, he's also looking to these sources as, maybe there's some gleans of wisdom and prophetic understanding I can get from these guys. And I even saw this in his own words. One of the rationale he used to justify that conclusion was, well, maybe that when God was making the revelations that he did to Daniel or to the Apostle John in revealing Revelation, Satan and his demons probably witnessed some of these exchanges. And maybe were aware of insider information, and involved in these types of things. And that's his logic for going down this road. Well, fairly recently, this individual not only decided that these Catholic prophecies were accurate, he decided a number of them were prophesying about himself. That they were prophesying about his role in what he was going to come on the scene and things he was going to do. In fact, he's recently declared himself a prophet. He has started his own Church of God organization, to get his own following. Now, this is an individual who was never ordained to any office in the Church of God, ever, to my knowledge. But that's what he's convinced himself of, because this is what playing that game did to him. You can't play with the fire. You can't look at this and say, well, I'm just so strong, I can go play with fire and the fire won't burn me because I'll outsmart it. It does not work that way. Just to reinforce this point, turn over to Job chapter 41. Just look at a warning that we're given here in the book of Job about dealing with Satan. Because you notice in both of these cases, the first individual, as I mentioned, was directly dealing with a demon and knew he was directly dealing with a demon. In the second case, this was an individual that didn't go necessarily to directly deal with a demon, but dealt with sources he knew were inspired by demons. And he himself would even state that. Notice in Job chapter 41 and verse 1, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook? Now, Leviathan here is a picture of Satan. Or snare his tongue with a line, which you lower. Can you put a reed through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you, and will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your campions make a banquet for him? Will they apportion with him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with spears? Basically, God is saying, can you handle all this? Could you take him on by yourself? Because the obvious answer is no, as we're about to read here. But the lesson God is trying to show Job here is, this individual, this Leviathan, is so much more powerful than you, but I'm so much more powerful than him, is basically what God's trying to demonstrate here. But because I've taken this guy as a servant, but he's not somebody you should dare to take on by yourself. And let's pick up here down again in verse 8. Lay your hand on him, remember the battle, never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is vain. So shall one not be overwhelmed by the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he should dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Because see, the point he was making here to Job is, Leviathan, Satan, is dramatically more powerful than you. You don't stand a chance against him. Well, Leviathan doesn't stand a chance against me, is what God's saying. In other words, I'm far more powerful than him. I can make him do what I want. But notice here when he's saying to Job, you wouldn't dare want to take him on your own. Because see, when we try to embrace the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom, that's Satan's way of life. And if you want to try to take that on and think, oh, but I'm so spiritually strong, I can handle it. No, you can't. Nobody can. Nobody is that strong. The wisest man in human history didn't successfully do that. None of us would have a shot at it either. Let's turn back over to Ecclesiastes now and pick back up where we were. And let's notice here, once Solomon got in this mindset, the actions that he took. Because again, he's got it in his head now, I can just kind of go take on whatever I want, and because I'm so wise, I can get away with it, and I can play with the fire, I won't get burned. Pick up in verse 4. I made my works great, and built myself houses, and planted myself vineyards. And I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. And I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. And I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all that were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver, gold, and special treasures of kings and of the provinces. And I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kind. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Now we're going to come back to that statement in a moment here, but just remember that. And picking up in verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Now notice what he did. He talks in here about all the things that he built, and he got servants, and he acquired gold, and he got entertainers, and he did all these physical things. Now none of these in and of themselves are inherently bad. It's not bad to enjoy life. It's not bad to build things and such. But the important thing is to realize this became an all-consuming focus for him. And notice also he said, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. Oh, you know this is going to lead to trouble in a hurry. Because think about that. He's basically abandoning the concept of self-control is what he's doing. You know, if it felt good to me, I pursued it. That's what he's saying. I didn't withhold anything from myself. Well, if you just think about that, you know, with a normal carnal human being, if they just let their carnal nature run wild, how much selfishness and lust and greed and, you know, other types of motivations he would have. If it felt good, he did it. Well, you know that's going to wind up in the ditch in a hurry. And it becomes an all-consuming thing. Because you notice that then all of his efforts are constantly trying to fulfill every physical desire that he had. Well, if you look at this, you notice he says in here, while he's doing all this, also my wisdom remained with me. Well, that's kind of a puzzling statement for us to look at times, because you go, okay, yeah, he's this incredibly wise man, we know that, but these aren't the actions of a wise person. You know, a wise person doesn't abandon the concept of self-restraint. You know, they realize that, you know, pursuing the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom, that's not a good idea. You know, because godly wisdom looks at that and goes, oh, that's the way of devoid of God and devoid of wisdom? I don't want to go down that path. I want to stay away from that, and veers in the other direction. Well, that's not what he does. Well, see, it's important to realize there is a big difference between having the understanding to know what's right and having the character and the self-control to do it. Because that's one of the biggest things that happened here. He has the wisdom to understand what the right thing is, but he's given up self-control. So whatever his physical carnal desire is, he pursues. Because see, wisdom can become corrupted. Turn with me quickly over to the book of Ezekiel. Let's look at another example of Satan here. So we're going to see there's some interesting parallels between Satan's life and the life of Solomon. Turn over to Ezekiel chapter 28. It's Ezekiel chapter 28, we'll start in verse 11. It says, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, thus says the Lord. Now, we won't take the time to go through all of this, but if you read through this, it's obvious that the king of Tyre is a picture of Satan. And you pick up here in verse 12, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. In other words, when God originally made him as an archangel, he was full of wisdom. He had a lot of wisdom, far wiser than a human being would be. But let's notice what happened due to the choices that he made. Jump down to verse 17. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Now notice his wisdom got corrupted because God had given him, you know, a good bit of understanding, obviously. But what did he do? He eventually got full of himself and decided that he could take on God. He decided that he could replace God, that he could outwit God and have his own will. That kind of sounds similar to Solomon, doesn't it? Because Solomon was given this tremendous gift of wisdom, of tremendous riches that God blessed him with. But what does Solomon eventually do? When God even comes to him and says, I'm taking the majority of the kingdom away from you, Solomon decides, no, I'll just outwit God. He can't replace me with a dead man. I'll just go, you know, chase down Jeroboam, I'll kill him, and I'll win. It's the same type of thinking. He has this incredible understanding, but wisdom can become corrupted. So let's go back over to the book of Ecclesiastes. Pick up where we left off here. In verse 12, so then I turned myself to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what can a man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. And then I saw that wisdom exceeds folly, as light excels darkness. And the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why then was I more wise? And then I said in my heart, this also is vanity, or this too is meaningless. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die as the fool? In other words, they both live out their lives, they both die, they're both buried, and life goes on. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was grievous to me. For all that is vanity and grasping for the wind. Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will rule over all the labor in which I have toiled, in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired for all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. And notice he's very, you might say depressed, despondent, just feels life is empty and meaningless through all of this. And this was a guy who set out to make life a big party, to make everything just fulfilling one carnal desire after another, and just thought he was going to have a life of bliss. And it turned out the exact opposite. But also just notice, let me share with you the meaning for the word despaired here, so you kind of get the feel for where he was at. It is the Hebrew word transliterated as yas, Y-A-A-S, Strong's number 2976. And according to the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the Old Testament by Warren Baker, it's defined as a verb meaning to despair. The word refers to despair in the sense that one concludes that something desirable is out of reach and usually stops working toward it. The word may refer to loss of hope in God or a false God. It may also refer similarly to a loss of meaning in life. So now you understand he said how he despaired with this. Why throughout this book he keeps saying, and this too was meaningless. And everything was utterly meaningless because it's lost its value to him. He just completely despairing from this. But he got from this trying to constantly seek his carnal physical desires. But notice what also happened to him. He went from being a guy, when he started off this whole venture, he asked for a gift that would not just benefit himself, but for everyone. And even when he came back from that dream and he throws a feast, he doesn't just do it for his own benefit, he does it for all of his servants. He's looking out for the overall good of others. Now here he is talking about, you mean when I die, I can't take it all with me? Oh, this is all just meaningless. This is a guy with 1,000 wives. This is a guy who had to have a lot of children as a result of this. Now certainly I'm sure a lot of these marriages came about as political alliances, and he didn't necessarily have a relationship with them. But realize also, this was a guy who said anything that was pleasing to my eyes, I didn't withhold from myself. Well, one of the things that happened there, he got into a number of these marriages because she's gorgeous, and she's gorgeous, and she's gorgeous. I think I'll have them all. So as a result of that, since honestly his sex drive was probably one of the things that he let run rampant and get him into this situation, there would be a number of children from this. But with all this wealth, there's no thought of, hey, I can benefit my children and my grandchildren and generations to come and see that they're all taken care of for years. No, his thought is, you mean when I die, I can't take it all with me? It's not all just going to satisfy me forever? That total selfishness is what ruined him. Because see, so oftentimes when we are thinking like that, in our minds we say, I'm looking out for number one. We think of ourselves as number one. And I'm just looking out for what's good for me. But in all reality, if that becomes our total focus, what do we wind up doing? We want to make a number one miserable. And it winds up not being for our own benefit. It's an important lesson to look at in life. Well, let's just continue on the thought here and pick up in verse 22. For what was man for all of his labor and for striving in his heart, with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his works grievous. Even the night in his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity, or this too is meaningless. And there is nothing better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? In other words, who's been a bigger lottery winner than me? We oftentimes think in our world today, oh, if I just won the lottery, you'll hear people talking about that. All my problems would be solved. I could quit this job and I could just vacation and life would just be a party. Well, that was Solomon's life. He had unlimited resources. That's how he had 1,000 wives. He didn't have to stop. He didn't run out of resources. He could just keep adding more and more and more. And it didn't turn out the way he was hoping. In verse 26, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. In other words, this too is meaningless, is what he's saying. Well, we can see from a picture of this a lot of the mistakes that Solomon made. what he wound up doing, like I said, he started off not taking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because his whole approach was, God, I want you to give me a discerning heart. You define for me what's good and what's evil by your godly understanding. And I'll follow that, because I'm a little kid, I don't know how to go. And he winds up at the end doing the exact opposite. No, I'm going to decide for myself. I want to know the way of God, the way of life devoid of God and devoid of wisdom, and I want to know it relationally and experientially. I want to do it hands-on. And that's what he does. And surprise, surprise, it bit him. And things didn't turn out. He didn't wind up happy. It wound up having a disastrous end to it. And that's part of the lesson that he learned from this. Now, if we look at how the book of Ecclesiastes is written, and especially how it ends, it very much suggests for us that this is a man who learned these lessons the hard way and came to understand this and to repent before he died. And while we're wrapping up here, just turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 12 as we wrap up this particular thought. But as I mentioned before, if we read just through the account in Kings, and when it ends there in 1 Kings chapter 11, you have the picture of, Solomon's out basically chasing Jeroboam. Jeroboam has to run to Egypt to flee because, Solomon's trying to kill him because he's basically trying to outwit God. And then it kind of wraps up his life and says Solomon died. Well, that would lead us to the assumption that Solomon died in rebellion to God. But I think when we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, it gives us a different picture. Because if you look at this book, as I mentioned, it's very much written from the perspective of someone who's looking back at their past mistakes, who has learned the hard way from them, and is sharing that lesson for us in the hopes that we wouldn't have to learn the hard way. And as I mentioned, he's going to refer to the conclusion of the whole matter here. That matter was, how does a person have the most enjoyable, fulfilling, pleasurable life that they can have, all the days that they're on this earth? That was kind of the question that he was wrestling with as he writes all of this. Well, he tells us the answer here in chapter 12 and verse 13. It says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil." So in other words, he's saying, don't do what I did. Look to God to define good and evil. Follow his instructions. It just turns out a whole lot better that way. That's what he's saying to us in the hopes that we can learn from his experience and not have to repeat these experiments in our own lives, is what he's trying to tell us. But again, and I'll certainly couch this as my opinion, this leads me to the conclusion that Solomon repented before he died. Because I have a very difficult time picturing someone writing this and giving this advice, and he's still trying to chase down Jeroboam and kill him, thinking he's going to outwit God. That seems very inconsistent. So to me, this has to be a guy that repented and came to realize the error of his ways and is trying to pass on the lessons that he learned from this for us so that we don't have to repeat these mistakes. Now, in looking at this series, we've looked at a lot of the bad decisions, you might say, that Solomon made, in spite of the incredible gift of wisdom that he was given. And as I mentioned, we can sit back, from our perspective, with some of the decisions that he made, especially, just when you look at the logistics and the numbers of the wives that he had and the obvious problems that would lead to, that leads to us looking at this going, okay, how did the wisest man in the world make some of these boneheaded decisions? Isn't some of this kind of obvious? Well, I think to get a balanced picture here, it's also important for us to realize the situation that Solomon got put in terms of the pressure that's got put upon his human nature. Because I think that it's important to have an accurate picture so that we kind of understand where he was at and how he would fall into these traps. As I mentioned when we went through this last time, there were two great gifts that were given to Solomon. God tells us outright in 1 Kings 3 that Solomon would be the wisest man who would ever live in the history of mankind. That there would be no one wiser before him or after him. We're also told that he would be the richest man of his time. In other words, there was basically, not that there hasn't been anyone richer since then, because again, it doesn't word it like that. But it says in his time, he would be the wealthiest man. He would be the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffett, the Donald Trump of his age. Now, when we think about the situation that put him in under both of those things, there's a lot of pull on human nature. Being a carnal, a selfish human nature person like all the rest of us, of what that could do to a guy and what that could do to him over a period of decades. And I think it's important we realize that, because there's a couple of warnings in the New Testament that speak to this. Turn with me over to Matthew chapter 19. Because what we're going to see here is that both of these things, although God certainly intended them as blessings for him, they could turn into curses, but based upon the choices one makes, and certainly the choices of what Solomon made with it. It's Matthew chapter 19 and verse 23. And Jesus said to his disciples, Assuredly I say to you, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And when his disciples heard it, they were exceedingly amazed, saying, Who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said to them, With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. See, Christ here directly warns us that it can be very difficult for a person with a lot of riches of this life, physical riches, to make it into God's kingdom. And why is that? Because we as physical people tend to trust in them. It tends to be better for us if God keeps us humble looking to Him, or if we have a lot of the means of this world, we tend to feel comfortable with that. Or we can tend to do what Solomon did. Notice this was the guy who built his mansion, and then he built gardens, and he built fountains, and he just took on all these other projects, and he got servants for himself, and he just brought in wife after wife after wife. How was he able to do all of that? Because he had more money than he knew what to do with. That's what enabled him to pursue all of this and decide, well, I want singers, and I want servants, and I want, so anything he could put in his mind that he could pursue, lack of resources wouldn't stop him from doing it, because he had more resources than he knew what to do with. That was also a curse. As much as that was a blessing for him, again, in terms of his choices turned it into a curse. I'm not blaming God for that. I'm just saying the way he chose to deal with it. But think about the situation that put him in as a carnal human being. When suddenly, all of a sudden, you can have anything you ever wanted. Well, what can happen? Life can quickly become the pursuit of this pleasure and that pleasure and that pleasure. And what happens to your relationship with God? It kind of becomes an afterthought, because there's so much fun to be had. There are so many things to pursue. There's so much I want to do. Well, that's what winds up consuming Solomon's life, is all the things that he could do with these riches. And that winds up, really playing to his human nature. Because remember, he's also king. He's the highest governing authority in the nation. There's nobody to tell him no. And he doesn't run out of resources. That's why he keeps doing this. Because, if you think of even polygamous societies, those still exist today, but you don't see anybody with 1,000 wives. If for nothing else, they run out of resources. So they stop bringing in more wives because they can't afford to support them. If you've got unlimited resources like he did, you can just keep adding to the problem. And that's what he wound up doing. And I think it's important for us to realize that and put ourselves in his shoes so we don't look at him as, how could this guy be so foolish? Well, he had the carnal human nature that all of us did. He just didn't, there was no built-in restraints. So it allowed him to just kind of take that as far as he wanted to go. We'll also notice he's also given an incredible gift of wisdom. And let's look at some biblical warnings of what great knowledge and understanding can do to us. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And we'll see where the Apostle Paul gives us some warnings on this as well. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and we'll start in verse 1. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing that he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. Now, if you think about that, what Paul is saying here is that knowledge can go to our heads. We can get impressed with ourselves and think that, as common as slang expression is today, that we're all that in a bag of chips. That we've got it all figured out. We're the man. Well, if you think about the situation Solomon got put in, he wasn't just the wisest man in Israel. He didn't just wow and impress everybody there. The kings and the queens of the other nations around him, we're given the example even of the Queen of Sheba, come to visit him to be wowed by how much wisdom he has and his understanding, and to challenge him with difficult questions. And even as the story of the Queen of Sheba that we read last time, she throws every difficult situation she can throw at him, and Solomon handles it all fine. And her assessment is, wow, even the stories I was told didn't halfway address, how incredible your wisdom is. Even the rower mill couldn't embellish it too much. Imagine being in a situation where for decades people come up to you and go, wow, you're just so incredible. Your understanding is so vast. You just knocked my socks off. And you hear that every day of your life for decades on end. What could that do to a person's ego? What kind of inflation of arrogance could this produce over time as we start liking to hear that? And even though you know that God came and specifically gave you this gift, after a while you just kind of think, yeah, I am the man. I really do have it all figured out like that. I really am that impressive. That's what can happen. In fact, the Apostle Paul tells us that God gave him a specific trial, specifically to try to avoid this very problem with him. Turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we'll read in verse 7. Unless I should be exalted above measure. Why? By the abundance of the revelations. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now notice this thorn in the flesh that Paul received here. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what this is. We've speculated about it for years, but we don't know for sure because the Bible just simply doesn't say. Probably the most common speculation that's made about this is that it was a health problem and maybe specifically an eye problem. But again, we don't know. Well, what we do know from this account is whatever it was, this was a trial that Paul did not enjoy receiving. This is something in one way or another, whether it was physically painful or emotionally painful, whatever level of pain that was, this was not a pleasurable experience for Paul to go through. And he requests 3 times, he pleads with God, please take this away from me. I'm not enjoying this experience. And God specifically comes back and says, no, I'm giving that to you for your own good. So I'm not going to take that away from you. But let's notice why he gave that to him. He said, lest I be exalted because of the abundance of the revelations. Now, what does he mean by exalted? The Greek word here that's translated into English here as exalted is transliterated as huperareo. It's H-U-P-E-R-A-I-R-O. Strong's number 5229, and according to the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the New Testament by Spiros Sahaites, it's defined as to lift above, elevate, exalt, be conceited, arrogant, insolent. In other words, what Paul is saying here is because so much was revealed to him, because remember, this is the Apostle Paul. He writes more of the New Testament than anyone else did. I mean, if we want to look at the New Testament, who's kind of the poster child superstar, what's the Apostle Paul? We have more books from him than anyone. So God obviously used him very powerfully and revealed a lot of knowledge to him. But Paul was saying, you know what? I'm a carnal human being, and that could go to my head. And that could cause me to be arrogant and think, I'm the man, and I got it all figured out, and I'm all big and bad. When in reality, no, I'm just the instrument that God struck down on the road to Damascus. And so I'm going to reveal this to you, and I'm going to use you as my servant, But it was really God who did all of this. But what Paul is telling us here, to keep me, in other words, to do me a favor, even though I didn't enjoy the experience, God didn't want me to fall into the ditch of becoming full of myself and becoming arrogant and thinking I figured it all out on my own. So God gave me this thorn in the flesh that was really an unpleasant experience that I did not enjoy, and I wanted it to go away. But God was trying to help me out and do me this favor to protect me from myself, in other words. Well, the point I want to get at in this is if you look at Solomon's life, none of that's recorded for him. When we look at his particular life, he's kind of like, again, what we would consider today a lottery winner. Everything went good. But because if you look at his situation, he's given this tremendous understanding and wisdom. He's given great riches. He's king of the nation. He has all power. There's no real significant wars or conflicts, during his reign. He kind of has everything. He's the top governing authority in the nation, so no one can really tell him no. So any woman he wants, he brings her into his harem. Any project he wants to take on, he does it. And there's no recording of any significant health problems he had. And again, we don't have everything about his life in the Bible. But there's no thorns in the flesh given to him that we have recorded. What can that do to a guy's human nature? And I think it's important for us to realize in looking back at his life that he got kind of set up here in a very difficult situation where his carnal human nature could run rampant. And that's what happened. Because even though he had all this incredible understanding, remember there's a huge difference between understanding right and wrong and having the self-discipline to make yourself do what you need to do. There's also, I think, a great lesson in, you might say, satisfaction in life and mental health that came out about as a result of kind of looking at the stories here. And what I mean by that is we've previously covered, what happened in Solomon's life and kind of the whole book of Ecclesiastes is a man setting out to try to find the most enjoyable, pleasurable, positive, fun way to live life, possible. But he tries to do it through physical means. And God kind of gives him every physical thing he would ever want to do until he just runs that one in the ditch. But his life, in terms of what we would physically, carnally think of as just having a wonderful life, he's the lottery winner that everyone dreams about being. He has everything, yet he winds up miserable. Let's contrast his life with the life of the Apostle Paul, because there's quite an interesting contrast between these two, and it'll teach us some lessons about satisfaction in life. Turn with me over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, kind of across the page here from where we have been. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 22. Now we've seen what Solomon's life was like. For the most part, it was a big party. Now picking up in verse 22, we're going to see what Paul's life was like. And are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure. In prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. In weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Now think about the life we just read here. Now if we were to compare these two, and if God were to kind of, similar to kind of the Solomon scene that we read about, if God were to come to one of us and say, hey, I got 2 choices for you. You can be king. You can be the number one, ruler person in the nation. You can have tremendous understanding and intellect and wisdom and impress all those around you. You can have riches more than you know what to do with. You'll never run out of stuff to do. And life can just be a big party. Would you like that? Or would you like to be the guy with health problems you're begging to go away from? You're going to be shipwrecked. You're going to be stoned. You're going to be thrown in prison. You're going to be beaten. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to have trial after trial after trial after trial. Which one of those 2 would you want? That's a no-brainer, isn't it? Just carnal, physically speaking. I'll take the Solomon ride. That sounds a whole lot more fun. Isn't that the way that we would want to go? Because physically speaking, that sounds a whole lot better. But if you look at how it turned out, we saw what happened with a lot of Solomon's life. He's miserable. He's saying it's meaningless. I hate it. I despair. I might as well just die because I can't take it all with me when I'm dead. But let's notice what Paul's view of life was. Turn with me over to Philippians chapter 4. It's Philippians chapter 4 in verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am in to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. I notice this is the guy facing all these severe trials, one after another, after another, after another. That's a list that we just read nobody would want to willfully sign up for. It doesn't sound like any fun. But in spite of dealing with all of this, he found how to be happy. He found how to have satisfaction in life in spite of his difficult circumstances. Now, don't get me wrong, being physical human beings, is it a lot easier to be happy when life's going good? Sure it is. That's just being human. But the point in here is, in spite of all the adversity, he finds satisfaction and meaning in life. Because we won't take the time to do it, but if you read through a lot of Paul's epistles, he talks about his joy. He talks about the things he's looking forward to, and you see this vision and hope for the future and some satisfaction in all of this. Whereas you read through a lot of Ecclesiastes, it's everything is meaningless and I hate it. You can see this drastic contrast that happens here. One of the big bottom line lessons in all of this is true happiness and fulfillment in life comes from having our mind in sync with God's. It comes from God's Spirit and from being reigned, our minds being ruled by God's Spirit. And to wrap up here, let's turn over to Galatians chapter 5. It's Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22. We're going to a very common, familiar scripture. Because what Paul shares with us here is the results of a mind that is being ruled by God's Spirit. It's Galatians 5 and verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love. Notice that second one, joy. Wasn't that what Solomon was seeking? How to have the most joyful, enjoyable life? Peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. But we just read about the life of the guy who wrote this. He had lots of adversity. He had trial after trial after trial. Yet he still found joy in his life and meaning and satisfaction. That was because he found it spiritually through God being involved in his life and God's Holy Spirit ruling his mind. And just to further support this point, turn with me over to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 1, and we'll read verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. The point I'm getting at here is that the most important factor in, you might say, mental health or good satisfaction, fulfillment in life, it's obtaining that spiritually through God's Holy Spirit ruling our minds. That is really the most important key. So to wrap up here, let's just turn back over to the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. And just to summarize here, as we know, the story of Solomon, especially as is recorded for us in Ecclesiastes, is very much a story of a man learning a lot of lessons the hard way. Because all learning in life is experiential, but we don't always have to be the one doing the experiencing. If we're smart, we're able to learn from the examples of others. And as we saw in the introduction last time, Paul even shows us that is the very reason why the Bible was recorded for us, was to give us the examples of all the experiences these individuals had gone through in the hopes that we would be able to learn from their example and not have to repeat all these things ourselves. And Solomon, as a man, set out specifically to find what is the way to have the most enjoyable, happy, fulfilling life possible. And to end the sermon here, I'd just like to end with the same conclusion that Solomon gives us in answer to that very question. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil.